Good morning and welcome to the 30th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. The first item on our agenda today is an evidence session with the Minister for Public Finance on the Budget Scotland Act 2025 Amendment Regulations 2025. The Minister is joined today by Scottish Government officials, Claire Hughes, Head of Corporate Reporting, and Craig Maidment, Senior Finance Manager. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting and invite the Minister to make a short opening statement. Good morning, Minister.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Committee. The Scottish Government is once again on track to balance its budget, despite continuing to face a challenging financial situation. Persistent high inflation, low economic growth across the UK, the continued cost of living crisis and wider geopolitical events means careful consideration has had to be given to balancing the budget. The UK Government's decision not to fully fund the increase in the rate of employers' national insurance contributions has added to the challenges we face in balancing the budget. Our prudent management of the 2024-25 financial year has allowed us to carry forward £557 million through the Scotland Reserve, which is being used in full to support the 2025-26 position. These amounts, in addition to in-year Barnett consequentials and an anticipated increase in the Social Security BGA, allow us to provide additional budget cover across portfolios to meet their emerging pressures within this budget revision. The autumn budget revision sets out the funding changes and amendments to budget since the 2025-26 Scottish budget was set. The revision allocated deploys almost £1.2 billion of additional funding to support our public services. It contains the usual four categories of changes. The net funding changes increase the budget by £1,137 million. And these changes include providing £697.5 million to health to support services, £173.7 million to local government, and additional funding for the increased pension age winter heating payment and the removal of peak rail fares. All the consequential funding received from the UK Government in respect of employers' national insurance contributions is allocated out as part of the budget revision. The technical, Whitehall and internal transfers are presented in the document in the usual way, and the supporting document to the autumn budget revision and the finance update prepared by my officials provides further background on the net changes as well as updates on information requested by the committee, and I'm very happy to answer any questions, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the first thing I would say is that, kind of 8-9 months on from the budget, it's quite incredible of the kind of range and extent of some of the actual changes that we've seen. And I understand that you pointed out that the health and social care budget is increased by £697.1 million, which is welcome. But of course, £667.8 million of that is transferred into finance and local government portfolios. So although the net changes the net changes are not quite as significant, I'm just wondering if you can talk us through some of those changes. And I would say one of the things that the committee raises at every one of these autumn budget revisions and indeed spring revisions often is the fact that we see the same budget lines being moved every year, and that's something the committee has raised concerns about. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through those at this time. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to first of all reflect on the principle of that, which in most cases is because the policy decision on how the funding is spent is in one portfolio and the delivery of the policy sits in another portfolio, and I suppose that represents or reflects the cross-cutting nature of the challenges that we face, and portfolios don't operate in silos. Indeed, a huge part, as the committee recognises, of the work we're taking forward in the public service reform agenda is to seek to break down silos and allow funds to flow more easily so that we can deliver on outcomes and not just focus on inputs in the budget sense. If you accept that policy decisions need to be made as part of overall policy in health, for example, but then the delivery of that resource is through another portfolio, then of course it makes sense to have those transfers.
Yeah, we get that answer every year, and I have to say the policy answer, there's policy here and delivery there. Surely the policy is where the delivery is, I would have thought. I mean, it seems to me just ludicrous, frankly, that every single year we get this huge big shift, and it just distorts, in actual fact, the kind of budget line, I think. And I plead again for the Scottish Government to rethink this, otherwise we'll be asking the same questions just ad infinitum. It doesn't seem sensible to me. I wonder
well,
if you can...
I mean, I think on that point, it's I'd be welcome input from the committee on how we address that. I wouldn't say it was ludicrous. I think it reflects the complexity of the work we're doing. The reality is that policy decisions are taken in the round across the budget to how best to impact that resources.
But the policy is clearly to deliver in one... Sorry to cut across you, Minister, but the policy, if the policy is to deliver in one area, if the funding is to deliver in one area, then that's really where the policy lies. I mean, because it's a bit of a kind of, it's a bit of a mirage to suggest the budget is ever in health and social care if it's always going to be transferred, you know. I mean, because the policy clearly is to transfer it every single year to where it's being delivered. Surely.
But the question is how much you transfer, and the question is how that coordinates with other work that's happening in that portfolio. So that's an important consideration as well. And as I say, I think this is as an approach as we take forward the public service reform agenda, as we recognise it's more about outcomes than it is about inputs. If we recognise that getting budget in the right place requires budget to move between silos, and we're breaking down those silos as we focus on, for example, where corporate costs are deployed, how we deploy digital costs, for example, across the piece, how we move towards preventative budget. And I can see this only getting more complicated rather than less, and I think we need to work together to understand how best to deal with that, because just putting money into portfolio silos and leaving it there is a great focus on inputs, but it doesn't really help coordinate outcomes in a way that breaks down silos.
Right, OK. Let's move on then. Technical adjustments increased the budget by £246.8 million. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through what those technical adjustments are and what they really mean. Yeah, £246.8 million. There's also the AMI provision for future NHS and teacher pension costs, which obviously is something that's not available for day-to-day spend, and that is the biggest part of that at £141.9 million. Transport Scotland, there's an extra £78.7 million, which is for Scottish Rail Holdings, non-departmental public body, and that's around lease costs for existing rolling stock. Again, that's got no impact on Scottish Government discretionary spending. And there's a transfer of £24.1 million within the student loans budget line, which reflects updated estimates for student loan capital and capitalised interest requirements. So again, another technical issue that doesn't have any impact on the Scottish Government's day-to-day spending. Another question that I seem to find myself asking every year is about pensions. So, for example, Justice and Home Affairs portfolio received an additional £122.6 million, of which £72.7 million relates to police and fire pensions. And in terms of NHS and teachers' pension costs, that's another £141.9 million addition. The question I'm always asking is the same as I asked last year, was effectively like, surely the government knows more than 1 year in advance what a pension is likely to be for a number of teachers or firefighters or police officers. Now, I can understand there might be, it might not be exact, but every year there seems to have been a chronic underestimate of what these costs are going to be, and every year there seems to be multi-million-pound increases to try and make up for that. So I'm just wondering if what the Scottish Government is doing to assess these figures more accurately and effectively, so that next year we don't see the same extent of adjustment.
I'll defer to officials on the technical aspects of this, because pensions are usually a complicated subject and it's affected by a whole range of factors, but I don't know if we want to...
Yeah, sorry, you go, Claire.
I was just going to say, so there's the NHS pensions, now that's dealt with an AMI budget, so that's annually managed expenditure. And that AMI budgets are very hard to predict, they're very complex. And basically what that is doing, it's the balance in payments. So we get money from employer contributions to the pension schemes, but then there's often a gap, so the cost of the pension is more than what we're actually receiving. So the sort of volatility element is basically, it's a correction to that. It's a balance in payment to make up the total value of the pension. So That sits in AME for...
But hold on, you're talking about 141.9 million, you're not talking about 5 or 10 million here or there.
Yeah.
And the volatility only ever seems to be one way, having looked at these over a number of years. We never see it where it's underestimated. It's overestimated. It always seems to be underestimated, and that's a huge amount of money. I mean, surely the government must know roughly how many people are going to be retiring next year. You know, so to underestimate pensions by 141.9 million in NHS and teachers alone seems,
So it's AME, so basically Treasury manage that volatility on our behalf,
right,
for AME budgets, because they appreciate it's really volatile. We can't manage that within our own Scottish budget. So there's no loss of spending power. If we start changing the conditions or it reaches a certain value, then Treasury would expect us to pay it out of our DEL budget, but because it's AME and because it's volatile, they recognise that and they cover the costs because it's broadly similar to what we see in the UK. With Justice, the payments are in DEL, so that does have to come out of our DEL budget, but Treasury have recognised that it should be in AME because it's far too volatile for us to manage.
I'm not suggesting that we change these. What I'm suggesting is that there's a concern about the accuracy of the figures, which just means that the autumn budget revisions need to be revised more than perhaps they otherwise should be. It's just about trying to get accuracy in terms of the figures and stuff like that, you know.
If it's helpful, we can come back with more detailed explanation of how this flows through. But I think the bottom line is, on paper there's a number moving. In reality, it doesn't obviously affect the day-to-day impact on the Scottish budget, and it's a function of a number of factors, including how UK government treats this as well.
Okay, well, one thing that seems to have had a major impact in terms of the finances is that finance and local government portfolio received an additional 204.3 million, of which 144 million relates to local government employment and national insurance contributions.
Indeed.
So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the overall picture on that is that the cost to the Scottish public sector is about 700 million, and the amount of money received from UK government is 300 so just about half of that. So there's money being transferred to portfolios to cover those costs, including obviously everything that the UK government added in to support that, which was barely half of it, and additional funds that the Scottish Government has had to find to help support those costs.
I mean, in my area, the local council is about £6.8 million down, even after the Scottish Government has made these payments, which is about 54% of the increase in council tax this year. So what's been the impact across the board in terms of this, in practical terms?
Well, I see that runs into hundreds of millions. The total cost is around 700 million. UK government is paid about roughly half of that. The rest of it, Scottish Government has, I think we paid 60% in many cases. So I'll check the exact numbers, but Scottish Government has put transfers in to help support portfolios. But you're absolutely right, the pain on this has been shared. Scottish Government has put in funds where we can to support that to a significant degree, but that doesn't cover all of the costs for all parts of the public sector due to the scale of the impact.
Okay, now in terms of transport portfolio, it says it's delivered £53 million of capital savings through reprofiling the vessel procurement schedule. So reprofiling, is that a kind of government speak for delay?
Well, what it means is that the cost that they'd estimated on that is not all being spent in that year. Now, you're never going to be able to judge that exactly in advance of what the cost profile may be. Things will change through year for a number of reasons, and as a consequence of that, you, as you know, regularly see a capital position where not all of the capital budget has been spent in that year.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's obviously been a lot of talk in the media about the alleged £1 billion underspend. So I'm just wondering if you want to talk us through the Scotland Reserve. I understand 566.7 million, as you put it, has been carried forward, and that represents about 79.5% of the cap last year, slightly falling to just under 76% this year.
Yeah, so as you rightly say, there's a £1 billion number being quoted, but of course that contains significant elements of known cash items which aren't relevant in terms of day-to-day expenditure. The relevant number in that regard is, as you said, 556.7 million, which in a total budget of 63 billion, is obviously less than 1%. So that allows us, obviously, none of that cost is lost to Scottish Government spending power, and it allows us to be able to support spending in this financial year.
Okay, so that's about that represents about 3 to 4 days expenditure for the Scottish Government.
Well, if you take it 365 days, then it's about 3 days. Yeah.
Okay, and just last from me, I mean, Spice have provided us with some information here, basically, and it looks at the portfolios, and we talked about how early on about how money each year gets transferred from the same budgets to the same budgets, and what we find then is that when we look at the budget bill as actually passed by Parliament, and we look at where we are now, finance and local government is up 9.9%, whereas educational skills is down 8.7%. So, and others are the variances are less than that. Health, for example, 0.1% up. So surely, if that this doesn't reflect really well on the budget process, if we find there's such a huge variance in terms of, I've heard what you've said about cross-portfolio working, but surely more must be done to ensure that the budget as passed by Parliament is really what's actually delivered.
Well, I suppose
the financial year, wherever possible.
Yeah, what's important is where the money is getting spent, and what's important is the outcomes and the impact it has on services. And if you want to compare numbers with other sets of numbers, then it's important to compare apples with apples. So you're comparing it at the same point in the process, either before transfers are made or after transfers are made, gives you a more accurate reflection on how those trends are operating, because I think we're very transparent in terms of what those transfers are, the need for them, and I agree on that, but from our perspective the policy delivery split is important, but that's very transparent, it's articulated, and as I say, to compare apples with apples, you need to be comparing the process at the same point in the process, so you can see what the shifts have been rather than comparing it at different points in the process.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that the committee has actually pushed for over the years, and I'm pleased to say that there has been some changes in terms of that as we go forward. Okay, we've got colleagues who are keen to come in. The first is Craig, to be followed by Michael.
Convener, good morning, Mr McKee.
Morning.
I was last night, and I agree with what the convener said about the difficulty in trying to look at year-on-year and in-year positions, given the way that the figures are presented. But I kind of tallied up that pay and pensions-related expenditure, additional pay and pension expenditures, of somewhere between 400 and 500 million within all of this. Given that you're saying that you need to balance your budget and you recognise all the constraints, including ENEX, I accept that. Had you not been able to draw down that money or receive those additional consequentials, where would you have found that £400 to £500 million?
Well, again, that represents less than 1% of the total budget. The Scottish Government balances the budget every year. The consequences on pensions, clearly there are rules in terms of how that operates, and funds are transferred from UK Government for that. And yeah, I'm not pretending that this process is easy, but the Scottish Government works through this on a weekly, daily basis to make sure that when we get to the year end we balance our budget as we're required to.
Obviously, one of the elements of balancing that budget will be to stick to your own pay policy, but littered through the figures, there's significant reference to pay deals. So local government, another £29.7 million for pay deals. Police pay award 6.2, 85.4 million to address pay pressures within the health service. What, for example, are those pay pressures within the health service, and how couldn't you have accounted for them as part of your 9%?
Well, clearly, as you go into the year, there's negotiations with the relevant trade unions and the workforce to arrive at a position where the pay awards are agreed, and then that obviously reflects on the budget number, and you don't necessarily know at the start of the year exactly what that's going to be. Now, as we move towards multi-year, and many of the deals now are 2 year or more, then that allows us a bit more certainty round about those numbers. But I think we value our public service workers. We think they should be adequately rewarded. Clearly there's been cost of living and high inflation, and that obviously flows through into these payments. And I think the general public would be comfortable that we are paying the people that are serving them, be it in the health service on the front line or in classrooms or in the police services. We're paying them well to do the job that they do, and also reflecting on the fact that, unlike down south, we've avoided the need for industrial action, which has been
so far
important.
But I think also taxpayers will look and say, well, if the Scottish Government are telling us that there's a 3-year 9% pay deal, but yet year one you already seem to be exceeding that, which is what these figures would highlight, should they have any confidence that you're actually going to stick to that 9% pay deal over 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, that is what's the policy is based on. The negotiations with each of the unions are in the context of that. You need to reflect the fact that inflation in some years will be higher, so it wouldn't necessarily be 3% each year. But that is the policy.
But in order to not have to cut expenditure elsewhere, if you've set a 9% pay policy over 3 years, and in, for example, one area, the 2-year projection is 7.5%, that leaves you 1.5%. You're going to bust your own pay policy, aren't you?
Well, see, the pay policy is there over those 3 years, and that's what we're working to. But you're talking as if spending money on paying public service workers isn't public service. Of course it is. Half of the budget goes on pay, probably more than that now. And that is the services that people receive. They're person-centred services, be it nurses, doctors, teachers, police officers. To maintain those numbers and continue to hire and recruit to those services, then it's important that we pay people, and that is precisely what the public would expect us to do to maintain the quality of those services. I
accept all of that, but this is taxpayers' money. You've set a public pay policy of 9%.
Yeah.
What confidence have you got that that 9% is going to be achieved over the 3-year cycle?
That is the policy that we're working to.
How can you compute 7.5% over 2 years? So are we now looking potentially in the public sector in the year after the election that you're going to be playing hardball with the union, something you haven't done so far, and actually saying to them, it's 1.5%, take it or leave it?
Well, I mean, the 9% is clear, and everyone understands that, right? The negotiations are happening with the trade unions. Each situation is different depending on its circumstances, and that the discussions that have been had have reached those agreements in the context of that 3-year policy for current pay deals, and as I say, that policy is clear.
So obviously you're the Minister for Public Sector Reform. You've set ambitious targets to reduce the core civil service headcount on the basis of being 2/3 of the way through this year. How have you achieved on the targets you've set yourself this year? Well,
as you'll be aware, the recruitment piece has been significantly focused on to ensure that we're only bringing in absolutely essential staff, or staff where there is a cost saving by bringing them in because we're replacing more expensive contractors or third-party services that are more expensive. There has been a reduction since, there's been a reduction in each of the last 2 years in the total Scottish Government workforce. The reduction this year is continuing, but we're on target to deliver another significant reduction. And we've got less staff. I don't have the numbers to hand, but we've got less staff in the Scottish Government now than we had at the start of this financial year. We've got less than we had 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and that reduction is continuing.
Shouldn't you have that number at your fingertips? Shouldn't you be able to say that?
It changes week on week, right?
Okay, roughly in...
No, there has been, I can remember the exact percentage, but there has been a significant reduction already in the first part of this year.
To plus or minus 10% of where it is?
Officials every 2 months, and every 2 weeks, and we make updated numbers every month, and we are on target to deliver another significant reduction this year, and that will continue, including over the period of the next 5 years, where we've committed to that.
It strikes me, Minister, that the vulnerability of the budget this year is in relation to pay and pensions, and there's the issue in relation to social security as well. I would have hoped you would have had that figure to hand, because it is vital.
I'll provide the updated number back to you
on
exactly where we're at on that. But there has been a reduction so far this year in the first 6 months, and that's continuing. We've got targets for each of the next 5 years that we're going to deliver on, as we have in the last 2 years.
Fine. And to just clarify, because obviously as you interrogate those numbers more closely, you can see the vulnerability in here, which it is possible to bring headcount down, but then employ far more senior civil servants and lose a significantly larger number of those on lower salaries, and therefore the pay bill is still rising. So do you have confidence that the pay bill, as well as the headcount, is going to fall over time?
That needs to be delivered, absolutely. And I get the point that you're making. part of the answer to that has been, of course, that, for example, you bring in IT staff, they're well paid because of the skill set they possess, but they're significantly cheaper than bringing in contractors or contracting a third party to deliver those services. So a significant part of that increase in those pay grades has been because of that, but across the whole budget that has delivered significant cost reductions.
So by the end of this year in the core civil service, you'll be able to come back to the committee into the next financial year and say that both the headcount and the cost of the core civil service in Scotland has fallen this year?
The civil service is now operating on a total operating cost to targets. This is one of the changes that we're making it into next year. It adds another layer of complexity that the committee will need to get their heads around as we go into next year, but looking at the total operating cost for budget for Scottish Government, core Scottish Government, which has traditionally been allocated by portfolio, so it's been a very small part of much bigger portfolio budgets. We're also now looking at that separately through the lens specifically of the total operating cost and setting budget numbers for that. So what that means is that the Scottish Government core civil service has to hit not only the workforce targets but also financial targets that have been laid out.
But you could still get around that by cutting other areas. What I'm asking you is, well, for example, pay and pensions are going to fall. Is that what you're saying? Total operating costs.
The total operating cost budget is being set with our over the spending review period. You also need to take into account inflation, but in real terms, that will be a reduction year on year.
Fine. If we just move to some other areas, just some points of detail. In relation to, I think it's £11.3 million has been provided for the two-child limit mitigation. Am I right in thinking that will actually come into effect next year? So what is the £11.3 million?
Comes in March.
In March, so that will be one.
Yeah, there'll be a small part of it will fall into this year. Yeah.
Fine. There was also the issue of £32.6 million to support, sorry, £30.2 million for the SQA to support ongoing activities. Can you say what those ongoing activities are and why?
It's operating costs for the SQA, and that budget needs to be reset to reflect the reality of their costs, and I know that's an issue we need to address. Okay, so why wasn't that in the original forecasts? It's the ongoing costs of the SQA and the. Yeah, you're right. It's
a big chunk of change, though. Yeah. You don't just suddenly find £30.2 million.
If you look back historically at SQA budget, you'll see the reality of what the spend has been, and that needs to be reflected in the budget going forward.
Well, it probably should have been there at the beginning of the year. Just in relation to an underspend, which is welcome in some respects, but obviously you've got net zero targets. There seems to be significant savings identified from demand-led schemes. Yeah. That'll be things like, windows, remediation to housing and things. Why isn't that being spent?
The total budget across there, I think, was just above 300 million. If you add up all the various schemes that are in play, the different funds that are operated there, I think underspend from maybe about 18 million. Yeah. So it's in the scheme of the 300 million, given it's a demand-led service, that reflects the 90% odd, 95%, whatever was delivered.
Talking to building societies, they're saying that people aren't borrowing anymore in the same way they were to do this kind of work to the house. Is public's appetite for this sort of activity, do you think, on the wane?
I think there is an appetite, and evidenced by the fact that almost £300 million was spent to support that investment. It's got, depending obviously on everybody's circumstances will be different, but the ability to save on energy bills and make a significant difference there, given the cost of energy, is very relevant to this. So individuals will find themselves in a place where that investment could make a huge difference over a period of time on their energy bills, and also, frankly, the quality of their housing and the quality of their life. So I think it's not even to mention the net zero impact. So I think it's an important investment, and clearly there still is an appetite for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, to be followed by Liz.
Good morning, Minister. Some are similar areas, but to start off with, where in these figures do you think we could see your agenda for public service reform?
I think that goes back to the point I was making earlier on about how you look through that. What we did last year for the first time was identify what corporate costs were across public sector. And that pulled at a number of approximately £5 billion, and that's driven the £1 billion saving targets that we're identifying there. So the issue with that, of course, is it's spread across every portfolio and every public body and right across government. So corralling that into one place so you can see that in a separate virtual pot, if you like, is an important piece of that mechanics. But that, of course, then lays another layer of complexity in terms of how the money is, how you look at those budget lines. So the answer to your question is right through the accounts. The way the budgeting process is developing is to setting those corporate cost reduction targets as part of portfolio budgets. So every portfolio will get, this is what you've done previously, this is what the new budget looks like. Oh, and by the way, on your corporate costs, we are projecting there's going to be these savings. Clearly, that will be different for every portfolio, depending on the profile. But now that we have that information, we're able to do that.
Okay. I suppose my reading of this, I mean, there's £1.4 billion of additional money available to the government, £1.1 billion available to portfolios. But it does seem to be that this is allocated in the increase in cost of delivering the same model of public services across Scotland.
Well, as I say, the targets for what needs to be delivered in terms of those corporate cost savings, which is one part of it, is clear that's been allocated across the piece, and you will take in any given portfolio, if you look at it through that portfolio lens, in health, for example, you'll see there'll be more doctors, more nurses, more spend on various parts of that service, including social care. But what you will also see is the corporate costs being reduced. Now, where that lays out in terms of the profile of the portfolio at the top level, level 2 or whatever, will depend on the amount of corporate costs that are in that portfolio. But there's a very clear focus on what the corporate costs are in each portfolio, what those reductions are and how that impacts their overall budget.
Is that what your scheme amounts to then? It's a bearing down on corporate costs rather than actually a different way of delivering public services in Scotland?
Well, there are different parts to it, right? But if you go through the public service reform agenda, there's 18 work streams in there, and I can also talk through them all. But some of that is core efficiency stuff, be it on estates, be it on procurement, be it on digitisation, be it on automation, etc., etc. A lot of that is in that corporate space. But if you look at the size of the prize, if you like, there's a significant amount of that on how we do integration more effectively, how we join up services, how we invest in prevention. So in terms of the integration piece, if you look at the whole family support work, which is about getting a number of agencies in a local area to be working together to understand how they interact with the individual and the family that they're all supporting, to be able to join up those services. So what do you need to do that? We've also got a work stream on data sharing, so that the same story doesn't have to be told multiple times, and different agencies and parts of the public sector are able to support because they've got the full set of information on the people they're working with, but also means that there could be budgets that need to move between those silos at a local level to best corral the resources and be able to deploy it in the most effective way. People not. So there's a whole range of stuff in there on leadership, on culture, on empowerment, on data sharing, on it, as well as the corporate cost. I mean,
it's fair to say that very little of that is visible in here. I realise these are budget revisions, and that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see it laid out as a kind of a mission-led kind of piece of work, and is represented here. But I think it's something that we would have to reflect on in terms of matching up to your programme of reform as to whether we're actually seeing the output of it.
I think there is to be honest, we're very clear on this, that the way we do budgeting, traditionally done budgeting, because we've been doing this stuff for a very long time in the public sector, doesn't necessarily lend itself to an environment where you've got money moving between silos, money moving to prevention, etc., etc. And we absolutely recognise that how this is, and I'm very happy to work with the committee on how we address that. Okay. Indeed, work streams 5 and 6 are all about preventative budgeting and how we configure budgets.
On the point regarding the net zero and housing underspend, I mean, this isn't a this year thing. This recurs every year, where these demand-led schemes are significantly underspent in different areas. That's, I think, a theme that's been the case for quite a while. Is that something you've challenged colleagues on who are running those portfolios, whether they're making accurate forecasts as to what the actual demand out there will be?
Well, significant. If you look at that example, I think it's 18 million out of 305 million, so it's 90, whatever it is, 4% or whatever the spend was carried forward. You're clearly making an assessment at the beginning of the process as to what it would be. And there's only three scenarios. You either hit it right on the button, which statistically is unlikely, or you're spending more or you're spending less. And we've had a conversation about spending more on certain areas, another conversation about spending less on other areas on demand-led services. So, yeah, there is always going to be either an
So no concern about that?
Well, concern, I think if you get it within 5 or 6% on a demand-led service, then I think you've got that's a reasonable projection, I would suggest.
The lower receipts that have come in on land and building transaction tax, about 40 million there. We've got a session this morning regarding construction taxes. I wonder whether you could account for why you think that number is lower this year in receipts.
Well, I mean, that number had been increasing, and I think last year the conversation was we'd receive more on that, and that's a prime example of we're either higher or we're lower. I think there was perhaps an overcompensation. If you look back historically, I think you'll see that number increasing significantly, and in most cases overshooting the estimate. I'll let officials talk to that in a minute, to the extent to which the SFC is relevant there, but in terms of their forecast. But I think there's been a case of we've seen it increasing significantly year on year, and there's been an estimate that it would continue, but it didn't quite increase at that level. But again, 40 million out of it's about $1 billion, I think, LBTT in total. So it's within 3 or 4% of.
Yeah, because just to flag that, I mean, that's an internal figure at the moment. We're still waiting. The FCC will kick off their forecasting as part of the budget work, and we'll reflect what comes out of that at the SBR. But it is just there has been a degree internally what we're seeing of slightly lower than anticipated LBTT take, which we didn't want to overestimate at this stage and then come to the SBR have a significant reduction in funding. So what we've chosen to do there is revise down our estimate, subject to what the SFC forecast as part of their budget work.
Okay. I mean, housing completion rates are amongst the lowest in recorded history. A reasonably cool commercial property market at the moment. Is that something that gives you concern, Minister, in terms of, I understand what you're saying here in terms of it's a relatively small percentage against the overall, but we're looking at trajectory and trend. Any comments on that in terms of the marketplace and what you're seeing?
Well, talk about housing market, there's a lot of complexity in there. The LBTT numbers, which obviously are a function of house prices and number of transactions, has been increasing strongly over a number of years. So this year it hasn't quite met that target based on previous year's growth. House price inflation is running ahead of general inflation, and there's clearly demand in the system. Which is obviously driving the requirement to increase in completions and the work that my colleague Mary McCallan is taking forward. So what you're seeing, I think, reflecting on those numbers, is a housing market that's still active, if you like, and still generating those returns. But of course, you need to consider all of that in the round, because the requirement house price inflation is good in one sense, but not necessarily good in another sense if you're trying to get onto the property ladder. So it's that market could be too hot. But considering where we're at just now, I think we've seen that growth. I think it's not been it's been stronger than expectations over a number of years, and that's reflected in the LBTT numbers we've seen coming back.
So you'd be comfortable in seeing additional taxation going on in this area?
Even in terms of rates of taxation?
Well, we're looking at a tax this morning on construction, so in the next session.
Yeah, and I'm going to be coming back, I think, is it next week, to talk to you about...
We'll look forward to that. But
indeed, me too, and I look forward to hearing...
Looking on the trend of the numbers, you feel comfortable that actually the marketplace can take additional taxation weight?
Well, first of all, the building safety levy, I mean, its genesis obviously is following from Grenfell, and the requirement to find the funds to support retrofitting of those at-risk buildings. The intention with the building safety levy is to raise about £30 million a year for Scottish Government funds. over a 15-year period, I think, from memory. The total funds required to retrofit is significantly in excess of that. It only covers a small part of it. The rest of that will come out of general government spending, which impacts other services, and it is a mirror of the policy that has been taken forward in the rest of the UK by the UK Labour government. So, having said all of that,
to the question. That's a description of the policy.
Indeed, rehearsing my lines for next week.
Well, indeed. So, but my question is, do you think at the moment, given what we're talking about trend, there's space in the marketplace for additional taxation?
We are very conscious of the cost pressures that house builders, in particular SME house builders, are under. Extensive engagement with Homes for Scotland and round tables with SME house builders on this, and we recognise there are a number of legislative and regulatory cost pressures that are impacting the cost of delivering housing units. So I look forward with interest to see the evidence you're taking on that this week, and I'll reflect on that before I come and talk to you next week.
Okay, thank you very much. Liz, to be followed by Michelle.
Minister, can I explore the issue of the underspend?
Yeah.
It's not a case that the money isn't going to be spent. It's a case about the timing,
Indeed.
which is always something that's perhaps missed in some of the media reports.
Thank you.
Nonetheless, this year the underspend in the economy portfolio is really quite substantial. It's £106 million, and that comes on top of the real terms cut of 8.3% to the economy portfolio 3 budgets ago, which was widely criticised, as you know, by business and industry. So could I ask about the sort of policy direction on this? Why is it, at a time when the government has got so much focus on economic growth, rightly so in my opinion, but nonetheless that kind of aspect of the overall spending in the government is really being, I would say, put at a disadvantage to some of the other areas, because obviously that's money that is essential to try to boost economic growth. Could you talk us through that decision-making?
I don't have that number to hand, but officials can pull that up on the underspend on economy and the specifics for that. But again, what's important is outcomes, and we continue to outperform the rest of the UK in terms of inward investment. We strong export growth. Yesterday I was the pleasure to go and open the premises for a Scottish biotech business in Glasgow, spin out from Glasgow University, world-leading technology. It's one amongst many businesses in that space, supported by Scottish Enterprise in terms of the moving to new and larger facilities. So that support is there. It's impactful. But it's important that it's targeted and effective and cost-effective, and we get results for that.
But Minister, I mean, nonetheless, notwithstanding the fact that there are some good signs within that inward investment, there are other very serious signs about the weakness in productivity, for example, the weakness in economic growth. And it doesn't sit well, I don't think, with the government's focus on trying to stimulate the Scottish economy when there are really quite disproportionate cuts to the economy portfolio. And I don't really understand why that's happening, and it would be helpful if you could explain that to the committee.
Well, first of all, as I said, we recognise the importance of economic growth. Of course, we do. It's central to the government's mission, and enterprise agencies have got a role to play there. They're not the only players there, but they do have a role to play, and the funding that's allocated is to support that activity that they take forward, which is obviously delivering results across a whole range of areas. So the budget process, of course, is a process of making sure that we allocate funds as appropriate across all those portfolios, given competing pressures, and there's no shortage of pressures across the piece. So the money that's allocated there, we believe, is effective to do what they're delivering. Of course, we'd like it to be more. But they are getting significant results with the funds that they are being allocated.
Yeah, but Minister, at the time, 2 budgets ago, when there was considerable criticism from business and industry, one of their concerns was that within the economy portfolio, there are quite a lot of enterprise schemes which help with the development of skills, which are absolutely essential to boosting the labour market in Scotland and also to boosting productivity. And it's on that basis that these are things that are very real to the potential of the Scottish economy. And it does seem strange, and I say it again, to have cutbacks or underspends at this particular junction where it's so urgent to try to ensure that that labour market is as buoyant as possible, that productivity is improving, and that we get some benefit in economic growth.
No, I absolutely recognise that we want to support that. As I said, economic growth and economic activity, there's a number of levers we can pull there. One of them is the investment that goes into the enterprise agencies, the Scottish National Investment Bank and others. I think that funding has been effective on delivering. Yes, of course, we'd like to be spending more there, but we're obviously, and this is a conversation about the shape of the budget more generally, it's a question of balancing those competing pressures.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to ask you to give away anything about...
All right, okay. I mean, talking about specific underspend, it's a lot of that's to do with historical issues around about European structural funds and how those were wound down.
Yeah, but Minister, within the Scottish budget, Scottish Government's decisions about recent budgets, there has been very considerable pressure on the economy portfolio with all the related enterprise schemes, etc., that try to boost the growth. And we've got, just, what was it, 3 weeks ago, we took evidence from Colleges Scotland about the pressure within the college sector for exactly the same issues. They're very worried about the pressures on the education budget for the development of skills, given that they're at the heart of many of our local communities, colleges. And they're very worried about the prospect of another budget where there will be difficult decisions made that affect their ability to contribute to that skills development and economic growth. Is that something that is really, can you give a guarantee that that's something that is at the forefront of the government's mind as it approaches this budget?
So, and first of all, in terms of the because we're confusing a number of different issues here. In terms of the underspend, the bulk of that was due to the winding down of the European structural funds in the final phase of that. So that's effectively addresses that point. In terms of the budget setting process that we're obviously moving into now for next year, I can give a guarantee that absolutely economic growth is central to the government's mission. It's one of the First Minister's 4 priorities, and we absolutely recognise the centrality of skills provision to that agenda to be able to drive economic growth across the economy. So that will absolutely be given its place in terms of the discussions that happen around about the allocation of funds in the budget process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Michelle.
Good morning, Minister. Thank you for joining us. I'm always struck when I listen to these discussions that it feels to me like every year we have these kind of tinkering type discussions between the autumn and the spring budget revisions, and it's a function of yearly budgets. And a lot of what we discuss is just for information, but they're not really, we don't get anywhere near kind of looking at the aggregate picture to say what are the real issues. And what made me think about this was the opening kind of discussion from the convener around, about reassignment of money to the delivery point. My working assumption is that the government, the Scottish Government, does that so it can retain control, because it's the only way from a budgetary perspective you can retain control to have this reassignment when you've got a fixed budget. Is that correct?
Well, I would say control, but I think it comes back to that point about you've got a complex but interrelated system. In order to be able to do a budget and have accountability, you need to break that into into chunks and silos, if you like. But, of course, there's a huge recognition that one of the biggest challenges we face is the ability to coordinate and integrate and join up and have funds flow to where they make the most impact, not just where they sit on the page. And that requires flexibility, but it also requires cooperation, and that cooperation requires that money needs to move between portfolios to facilitate that.
Yeah, but it's underpinning all of that is a fixed budget.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I suppose my gentle challenge is that to local government, there's still, it may shift in the future, but there's still ring-fenced funding so that government can ensure its priorities are met. And I think I may have asked this question last year, but if I said to you, right, N% of any budget, let's call it housing, for example, because of the kind of multi-factor economic benefits, why don't you attribute the same discipline to yourselves on making a fixed percentage of your budget? Maybe housing's a bad example because of capital, which we may go into, but because the problem with this, and this tinkering as I describe it, is always short-termism. And if you don't set aside a certain percentage and say, right, N% is always going to be spent on something that we know gives economic benefits, you're actually perpetuating the status quo of tinkering, notwithstanding I fully accept that annual budgets are a function of the role of the fixed budget and the role with Treasury. But I think every year I hear this and it's got an insidious impact on long-term strategic planning aligned to economic growth by this constant kind of tinkering of budget monies from pot to pot.
Well, you call it tinkering, you can call it agility, right?
One person's tinkering is another's agility.
But I mean, I think that, well, there's a number of things in there. There's yes, we work in an environment where not only is a fixed budget and we need to balance that, even a fixed budget because it moves in year depending on consequentials. So I mean, even at this point, we don't know what the final position is in terms of 25, 26. We won't know that for a period of time yet. So you're always moving, not even a moving target, but the amount of money you've got to hit that moving target is also itself a moving target. So you're having to balance all of that. So that creates complexity. So clearly in an environment where you had the ability to give multi-year, you knew that position multi-year position from UK government, you'd be able to lay out multi-year spending for various parts of the system,
but
which
with
you're
respect,
right.
Local government doesn't know that.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, but the Scottish Government says to local government, and you can track the numbers and say that it's an aggregate percent that has to be ring-fenced for an entire session's policy priorities. So if you can do it for local government, why can't you do it to yourself in terms of that fiscal discipline?
Well, as I say, you're hitting a moving target in a number of dimensions there. There's demand-led stuff which is changing. There's what you've got to spend, which is changing depending on consequentials.
Local government, that's the point I'm making. They have that as well. They've always got a whole range of different things. They're subjected to the
well, yeah, I appreciate that, right. But I don't understand the point you're making. They will operate within that environment. They know their budget could change during the year. They do have reserves to manage as well. They've got the whole range of levers they can pull, as we do, but we are constrained by that broader picture.
Well, that's my point. I'm sorry if we're at cross purposes. That what you're illustrating for the Scottish Government is the same scenario for local government, and yet the Scottish Government will choose to say that to give ring-fence spending to ensure policy commitments are met and to allow a sufficiently long-term basis for that to see the outcomes coming out at the other end. And so my question or my challenge is that if you will understand that slightly longer-term picture is needed, and you're saying, right, well, you just need to manage all these other moving parts, why won't you apply that to the Scottish Government in those areas where we know it will give material benefit on a longer term basis?
In terms of multi-year funding?
No, right, again, I know perhaps I'm not being clear, but transport, there's always going to be money for transport because everything would fall apart if folk can't travel from A to B. So the Scottish Government is able to say that within an envelope, roughly we're going to be spending X to Z on transport. You're not going, I wonder if we'll get any money for transport next year. So you're making working assumptions about budget money that will be in there. What I'm saying is, why can't you ring fence, or why won't you ring fence money that goes into other areas that you know gives economic growth in the same way you would do for transport? Because not everything is like on a year-by-year basis. You ring-fence money for councils and leave them to manage those in-year budget challenges, but you don't ring-fence money for particular areas within your own portfolio, despite the vagaries of all the stuff that's happening.
Again, I'm not kind of following here. I mean, within our portfolio, I mean, what local government delivers is services, education, it delivers social care, it delivers housing, whatever that are within that total budget. So there is complexity there in terms of what moves around. Everybody's working within that environment where, unfortunately, we don't have certainty on multi-year funding, and things change within year. And increasingly, as we move roll out the reform agenda, the interconnectedness of this and the requirement to have flexibility on how those funds move. You take the whole family support, for example, that's a whole series of funding pockets coming from different portfolios, but on the ground when you have got a whole range of experts, or not experts, but public servants engaging with an individual family, they want that to be joined up. Everyone wants that to be joined up, but to do that effectively, you need to have a mechanism that allows funds to flow effectively at that very local level. So that's the reality of what we're doing. In terms of ring fencing, I mean, there's very little ring fencing in local government, right? And the vast majority of that's been taken out, and local government, for the most part, has got decision themselves to be able to make as to how they allocate those resources.
Well, I won't labour the point in the interest of the rest of the committee, but I just wanted to pick up something that Claire mentioned earlier about Amy versus Dell for the pension contributions. I mean, I find that staggering that that's been going through Dell from a Treasury perspective, given the type and nature. How did we get to this position? Because that surely can't be the case in other budgets coming out of Whitehall. It seems staggering.
I think there's, I suppose, arguments to have an Amy or Dell. I think the benefits of Amy is that UK government covers the losses, but you don't get to keep the gains. So if it's less than expected, you don't get to keep that underspend. It goes back to Treasury. So this has been...
When is it ever less than expected?
Well, I think, pensions is risky. I think that's been recognised by officials and by ministers, and there's been quite extensive conversations with Treasury on that and the risks that we carry. And there's now been an agreement to transfer that budget into Amy for police and fire pensions. So it will follow a similar treatment to the NHS and teachers' pensions.
I know, and I suppose the point I'm making is that that's not a surprise to me, that risk. And I'm suspecting it's not a surprise to you either. So I'm just kind of quite surprised that we've been in this position, because assessment of risk, not just the treatment of what funds come back, must surely be part and parcel of the decision as to which budget pot it went into. And is this just kind of catching up with a still relatively immature system between Whitehall fiscal transfers, or was there something more?
I don't know if Craig has anything to add. It was a historical decision.
It's been something that's been in play for probably the best part of 20 years, I think. That when the system was devolved, police and fire pensions was attributed in Scotland to be a Dell budget. It was also Dell in the rest of the UK, and there was a point in time where that was switched to Amy in the rest of the UK. We didn't reach agreement at that point for it to be switched in Scotland, and have borne the sort of top-up element costs out of Dell over the last, say, 15 to 20 years. So, as Claire said, there's discussions and broad agreement on transferring that to Amy going forward. So that will remove that risk. But it has been a relatively long-term point.
Yeah, just of interest. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. That appears to have exhausted questions from the committee. Just make an appeal to you, Minister. I mean, we talked there about, you've mentioned flexibility, you've talked about outcomes and most impact, but just in terms of the credibility of the budget and the kind of portfolios that we discuss and debate over as we go through the 3 stages of the budget, when we've got stuff like investment in the integration of health board social care, which will be £257.2 million this year, housing to local government within a finance and local government portfolio for discretionary housing payments, £79.2 million, and transfer from health and social care to education skills portfolio to pay the teaching grant for nursery and midwifery students, which this year with £49.3 million, moving every single year at this point. It surely would be much better to have them in the budgets where delivery will take place. Now, I don't see how that adversely affects outcomes. It might affect how some budget portfolios look in terms of presentation publicly of the budget. I think there's perhaps an element of that in government thinking, but it just seems to me that, I wonder how many more years we're going to have these continued transfers, because it happens every single year. And I think if Parliament is going to be voting for a budget, as of course it does every year, then the more it reflects actual expenditure, I think the better it is.
Let's explore that because it is important. If you take the health and social care one, which is the biggest one, the whole thesis is that within the health and social care environment, it's cheaper to have people, more cost effective and better for the individual and better for outcomes, to have them moved through the system into social care. Right? And the reason that doesn't happen to some extent is because the fund is not there for that. And if you look at the health and social care budget in the round, it's more cost effective to have that money in the social care environment than it is to have it in the health environment. Okay? So to be able to do that, to recognise that how you do that balance, you have it in the same portfolio. But the delivery of that social care piece, and that's the reason for the transfer, is in the local government portfolio. And part of the issue is if you have those completely separate, then the restrictions on what you're spending on social care, you're not investing there to the extent you need to be able to free up beds in acute hospitals. So that's a concrete example of the fact where this is interrelated, why the policy is in one place, but the delivery is somewhere else, and there is a need for those budgets to be able to reflect that.
Well, if it's going to be moved every year, then it should be where it's going to be spent.
But the question is how much is going to be moved every year.
Well, indeed. But I mean, if you're talking about 200, well, next year it's going to be 250, 300 million. So if it was in the budget, for example, it's 250 million, saying you had to move 5 million or 10 million one way or the other, then that's not quite the same as moving sums of this amount. And housing discretionary payments, they're always going to be roughly the same amount, aren't they? I mean, 75, 80 million, maybe next year will be 85 million. So but it's roughly, that the government's not going to spend less than 75 million next year, so why not just have that in the portfolio to start off with? And this training of nursery and midwifery students, again, 49.3 million. Well, if there was 45 million in that budget, members would have a clearer view of exactly what was happening in that area. And if you had to move 1 or 2 or 3% here or there, fair enough. But I just think it presents a much more clearer and more accurate picture of the budget as it's presented, not just to parliamentarians but the wider public. Okay, so we're now going to move on. I want to thank the Minister for his responses to our questions. We're now going to move to agenda item 2, which involves formal consideration of the motion on the instrument. I'd like to invite the Minister to speak and to move motion S6M 19303, that the Finance and Public Administration Committee recommends that the Budget Scotland Act 2025 Amendment Regulations 2025 be approved.
Moved, Convener.
Thank you. Do any members wish to speak to that? No? No one wishes to speak. I'd like to therefore put the question on the motion, which is that motion S6M 19303 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is agreed. I'd like to thank the Minister and his officials for their evidence today. We'll publish a short report to the Parliament setting out a decision on the draft instrument in due course. Thank you, Minister.